Welcome back to Catalyst University. My name is Kevin Tokoph, and in this video and the next few videos, we're going to be discussing the intricacies of core strengthening. Now, core strengthening is a topic online that gets a lot of heat, a lot of debate, and a lot of dogmatic opinions on different sides of the core strengthening spectrum. And there's just a lot of misinformation and maybe half-truths and so forth online. What's true, what's not? We're going to be exploring a lot of facts in this video and maybe come up with a method or methods of how to best and optimally train your core. So to do that, we're going to be exploring and dissecting a series of bullet points that you can see here that I like to call the core tenets of core strengthening. And yes, the pun is intentional. Now, before we get too far into any of that, we really need to have a basic understanding of what is the core. The core is a series of muscles on the front, the sides, and the back of the abdomen that serve a number of functions. One of them, very generally, is to create stability of the lumbar spine, the lumbopelvic region, and the lower thoracic spine. It also serves to generate movement of those same regions. A lot of these muscles also help to compress the abdominal viscera, hold them in place, and maintaining a good intra-abdominal pressure with the help of the diaphragm and the pelvic floor, which we will cover in other videos at some point. And each one of these abdominal muscles tends to have its own unique function. Okay. If we're looking at the rectus abdominis, for example, the rectus abdominis helps to generate trunk flexion, so resisted lumbar flexion. The oblique muscles, both external and oblique, external being more superficial, internal being a little bit deeper, it's actually one layer deeper, those muscles help to generate side bending and rotational force, and also resisting against those movements. And the transversus abdominis, which is deep to all of those, it actually has a direct attachment on the bones of the lumbar spine and plays a huge role in spinal stability. On the posterior aspect, we have the quadratus lumborum, or the QL. It sits under the 12th rib on each side. It plays a role in lumbar extension and side bending, and also creating some coronal or frontal plane stability of the lumbar spine. And then we have the paraspinal muscle group. Paraspinal muscle group involves some really small muscles. Probably the main one that you've heard of is the multifidus. Plural is multifidi. And then you have the larger spinal erectors, which play a role in extending the lumbar spine and actually resisting excessive lumbar flexion. All of those muscles comprise the core. Now, when most people think of the core, they just think of the front and lateral muscles. Front being rectus abdominis, lateral being the external and internal obliques, and then deep to that, the transversus abdominis, so those four. Now, technically, the core includes every single one of those muscles that I just mentioned. However, in the vast majority of scenarios, unless stated otherwise, when people talk about the core, they're usually referring to the front and lateral muscles, the rectus abdominis, the obliques, both of them, and the transversus abdominis. Those are usually what people are referring to as the core musculature. When people talk about the abs or abdominal muscles, those are certainly the four that they're talking about. Usually abs doesn't refer to the quadratus lumborum or the paraspinal muscles on the backside. But technically the core is all of those. So when we talk about the core in this video and the next few, technically we're referring to the abdominal muscles. Extension of the lumbar spine and those ones in the back, normally we train those quite differently, and we'll be talking about those in a separate video or videos. So enough on those definitions. Hopefully we're all on the same page now. Let's get into those core tenets right now. So on to the core tenets of core strengthening, and here's core tenet number 1, shown right here. All 4 major core muscles activate when performing a core strengthening exercise. So when I say core strengthening exercise in this manner, and it'll differ a little bit when we get to the next couple videos, I'm including any core exercise. It could be a core stability exercise, meaning isometric in terms of the core, a suitcase carry, suitcase deadlift, farmer's carry, Pal-off press, anything like that that's isometric. It includes those. And it also includes our dynamic core strengthening exercises like a GHD sit-up or a Roman chair side bend or anything like that. Anything that uses the core, all 4 core muscles activate. Right here is a figure from a systematic review and meta-analysis that I have linked in the comments of this video. And essentially they took EMG data from a bunch of individual studies and looked at the EMG activity of the rectus abdominis, the external and internal oblique muscles, that's EO and IO respectively, and then the transversus abdominis muscles. And what you can see in particular on the section by Cromer et al. In 2018, they actually took EMG information from every single one of those 4 muscles on these various exercises. And what you can see is that all 4 of them activate. You cannot isolate any of the core muscles. So it might seem intuitive from a textbook point of view that a sit-up type of motion would get the rectus abdominis. But realistically, all 4 of these muscles activate regardless. Anytime somebody says a deep core isolating exercise, that is utter nonsense. You cannot isolate the deep core, and what does that even mean, deep core? Generally, people are referring to the transversus abdominis. But long story short, you cannot isolate any of these muscles. All 4 activate together. Now that brings us to core tenet number 2, which is shown right here. Different core exercises, while failing to isolate any one core muscle, generally have 1 to 2 muscles that predominate, but normally not by any significant margin. What does that mean? Well, let's break it down by looking at this table, which is also from another study that I will also have linked in the description of this video. They looked at EMG data as well for 4 different muscles, really 3 muscles, but 2 sections of the first one, and those would be upper rectus abdominis, lower rectus abdominis, external and internal obliques, and they didn't utilize the transversus abdominis because realistically measuring the EMG activity in that muscle is very difficult. In a lot of cases, it actually involves invasive EMG, and so you're not going to be able to do that on any complicated exercise that you see listed here. So a lot of these are very dynamic exercises, and you can imagine that it's going to be very difficult to have basically a needle inside somebody's muscle while you're doing that. So obviously they didn't do that. But in any case, let's take a look at this table right here, more specifically at the first exercise, the power wheel rollout. That's essentially just an ab rollout with an ab wheel. Very tough exercise. And it's going to get all 4 core muscles. Now we see here the rectus abdominis and both oblique muscles, but we know with a very high degree of certainty that it's going to get the transversus abdominis muscle. It's just not tabulated here for the reason we just mentioned. We just don't know to what extent it's going to activate relative to these other 3 core muscles. But what you can see is that the muscle that predominates based on EMG data is the rectus abdominis, both upper and lower. It gets a little bit more activity than the external and internal obliques. So, is this an isolation exercise for the rectus abdominis? Absolutely not. There's no such thing as a core isolation exercise, but it does get a little bit more rectus abdominis, okay? Now on to the second exercise. This is the power wheel pike. Now, the power wheel pike is very similar to the rollout with one major difference. In the rollout, the wheel is essentially being held by your hands. So your legs are static, whether you're on your feet or your knees, and your arms are moving back and forth. So legs static, arms mobile. In the power wheel pike, you actually put the power wheel on your feet. It's actually a special type of ab roller that actually has attachments for your feet. And so your hands are the static part and your legs are mobile. But nonetheless, it's still a sagittal plane movement that involves resisted lumbar flexion. And it's actually very similar looking to the ab rollout. And so you might infer based on that, well, if the ab rollout was mostly rectus abdominis, surely the pike would also be rectus abdominis. Certainly gets the rectus abdominis, but if you look here, the obliques actually predominate, external and internal. That's quite interesting, because if we were to base this totally off of what a textbook tells us, that the rectus abdominis is involved in lumbar flexion, obliques are more involved in side bending and rotation, well then these power wheel exercises like the rollout and pike, these should be more rectus abdominis, because there's no side bending, there's no rotation, but that's not what we see in practice. So don't rely totally on what you learned in anatomy. If we even go down to the power wheel knee up, which is similar to the pike, the legs are mobile, but the difference being that the pike is a straight knee version, so it's long lever. The knee up is where the knees are bent, so it's short lever, a little bit easier. Same thing, we see the obliques predominate on that movement. All 4 core muscles activate, but the obliques seem to predominate there. So you might make the argument, okay, if the arms are more static and the legs are mobile, maybe it's more obliques. If the legs are static and the arms are more mobile, maybe it's rectus abdominis. But then we go down to the other exercise I have highlighted there, the reverse crunch, incline 30 degrees. A reverse crunch or a reverse sit-up, great exercise, by the way, but that's also where the hands are static, legs are mobile, similar to the pike and the knee up. And what we see there is the internal oblique predominates, and so does the upper rectus abdominis. So there's two big points that come out of this. And that first bullet point right there is focus should be placed on training and gaining strength in different directions of movement. So, in my opinion, it is not as effective or optimal to try to train the specific muscles of the core. Because as you can see here, the muscle activation patterns can be very unintuitive. You could think you're going a lot more after rectus abdominis, but you're actually hitting more of the obliques. So my recommendation would be, instead of trying to train a specific muscle, because it's very difficult to predict how you're going to activate it and to what extent, it would be better to get stronger in the three major planes of movement involving the anterior and lateral core muscles. And those would be getting stronger in resisted lumbar flexion. So for example, GHD sit-ups, cable crunches. Getting stronger in resisted side bending, so you could do Roman chair side bends or hold a kettlebell and do some of these, right? And then also getting stronger in resisted lumbar rotation. If you get stronger in those three isolated movements, you're going to hit every single core muscle, and those directions of movement that you're getting stronger in, translating to stronger core muscles overall, will then translate into your specific sport. And then the second point that I've kind of already hit to death there, muscle activation patterns here are not intuitive. Can't isolate, and you can't really predict which muscles are going to hit the most with given exercises. So train the movements, not the muscles when it comes to the core. Moving on to core tenet number 3, which is shown right here. Training for aesthetics does not necessarily equal training for strength when it comes to the core. So in talking about this, we're going to answer the age-old question that pops up on the internet from time to time, and it gets really heated and really contentious, and people have their opinions, and 99% of them are just flat out wrong, and I'll tell you why. And that's, where are abs made? In the kitchen or the gym? Now let's get one thing out of the way real quick. If all you care about is strength, getting your abs, your core, whatever you want to call it, stronger, that's easy. You just do core strengthening exercise and progressively overload over time. So maybe on a GHD sit-up, I start with my arms crossed. When that gets too easy, I put my hands behind my head. When that gets too easy, I have my arms outstretched. When that gets too easy, I start holding a dumbbell here and I just add more and more resistance and I get the movement stronger. I can play that same game on a Roman chair side bend. I can play that same game with lumbar rotation exercises. You just lift more and more weight over time. The muscles and the movements get stronger. And strength doesn't care if the abs are visible. And realistically, as you can see written right there, invisible abs can actually be far stronger in some cases than visible abs. Strength doesn't care whether or not they're visible. In fact, some of the strongest people I've ever met in terms of the core, they're not visible. When we start talking about aesthetics, that's sort of where we get more into the argument, is it more the gym or the kitchen? Because if we're just talking about strength, the vast majority of it is the gym. Now, obviously, you do have to intake enough protein to meet the demands of growing and strengthening muscle. But honest to God, for most people, getting enough protein is not that much of an issue. The bigger issue is, are you training hard enough and progressively overloading for strength? But for aesthetics, so whether or not the abs are visible, a big question is gym or kitchen. Now, this illustrates a really big problem with our society nowadays, and that is that we've sort of lost the ability for things to be both. Like, people on either end of an argument are so dogmatic about it, and they're willing to die by their side of the argument, that they fail to see that most things in life are not binary. Most things are grayscale. It's a combination, and a lot of times a weighted contribution of two or more options. So in a lot of cases, it is a combination of gym and kitchen. Now, when it comes to having visible abdominal muscles, arguably the most important factor for most people is having a low enough body fat percentage that the abs become visible. So having low enough body fat in this area. And for a lot of people, that may occur give or take around 10%. Depends on other factors as well. But a 10% body fat for men, it's going to be a little bit higher for women. But you need the body fat percentage low enough to where those muscles become visible. And realistically, this boils down to, in large part, a kitchen argument. We're going to explore the kitchen side of this first. So when it comes to diet and weight loss versus weight gain, pretty much what the evidence says now is that even though, yes, some foods that are high in sugar might spike insulin levels, and insulin has all these biochemical effects that we've talked about on other videos on my channel, generally speaking, weight loss versus weight gain approximates to what's higher, your calories in or your calories out, your caloric intake versus your caloric expenditure. Generally speaking, if your caloric intake is greater than your caloric expenditure, you gain weight. If your caloric expenditure is higher than your caloric intake, you lose weight. If they're about equal over time, you maintain weight. It's actually quite simple. So if you are somebody that is needing to lose weight in order to get the abdominal muscles visible, then you want to have your caloric intake less than your caloric expenditure. And if you have a situation like that and are consistent with that over weeks to months, you will lose body fat. And one of the areas you will lose body fat is likely the abdomen. And if you can get your body fat percentage to a certain level, give or take around 10% if you're male, a little bit higher if you're a female, the abs may become visible. Now, one really important point here before I move on, and that is that you cannot preferentially target one specific area for fat loss. So for example, let's say I have two areas that I need to lose weight in. I got body fat in the thighs, body fat in the abdomen. I cannot just do a million crunches and get rid of my abdominal fat. Fat loss occurs globally. Now, there may be certain areas of a person's body that are more predisposed to gaining more body fat in. For example, some people gain it a lot more in the abdominal area. Some people gain it more in the buttocks and the thighs. Some people gain a lot in the arms for different reasons. Those areas that gain a greater amount of body fat may experience a slightly larger rate of fat loss than an area that doesn't have a lot of fat, like in the face, for example. But fat loss occurs globally throughout the body. You cannot target one specific site. Now for the gym argument. Let's say you've got somebody who has small, underdeveloped abdominal muscles, maybe the rectus abdominis for that washboard look. It could be that they just never worked them. It could be that they had an injury and something happened, maybe some kind of condition. Who knows? We could make up a lot of stuff, but they're small, they're underdeveloped. So the person loses body fat. One of the areas they lose it in is the abdomen. And even at maybe a 10% body fat, because their ab muscles are so small, they're not visible. So what would that person need to do? They would need to go to the gym and do some abdominal strengthening and get some hypertrophy, get some size in those muscles, and then maybe they start to become visible at the same body fat percentage. And for that same person, if they never worked their abs, they would have to go even lower body fat percentage, lower, maybe even to unhealthier levels just to get them visible. So yes, you do need to have some size to them for them to be visible. It's not all kitchen, it's not all gym, it's a mixture of both. And depending on the person, it may be a different percent contribution from each. Let's say you're the type of person who is naturally slender. I don't mean skinny, but just a more slender individual, okay? You naturally don't put on a lot of body fat. Well, that person is probably going to need to occupy a smaller percentage coming from the kitchen, a greater percentage coming from the gym to get those muscles hypertrophied. But if I have another individual who puts on body fat much more easily, and they naturally have a little bit more, they're going to have spend a little bit more allocated percentage in the kitchen, dieting, getting the body fat percentage down, because they can hypertrophy those ab muscles all they want, but if there's that still body fat covering them, they're just not going to be visible. So is it kitchen or abs? It's both. It's both. But some people may need a greater percent contribution coming from one or the other. So hopefully that was a good introduction to our core tenets of core strengthening. In the next video, we're going to tackle a fairly complex topic that also gets a lot of heat and debate online, and that is the idea of core stability. What is core stability and what is it actually good for? And I think you're going to find that most people online actually don't have as much of an understanding of it as you would think. So make sure to join us in the next video. Please make sure to like this video, subscribe to my channel, and hit that notification button for notifications for all videos in the future. Thank you so much.